on this. Welcome all of you that have made it this far. There's attrition rate on this retreat. I'll know to do more retreats on compassion and metta because people stay till the bitter end. Buddha taught a middle path, as you all know. Majjhima Patipata. Pada is just like literally path. Pati is like practice, path of practice. Majjhima, middle. For him, it was a path of practice between the extremes of indulgence in sense desires on the one hand and fighting them on the other. Aversion. Those really the first two hindrances that the middle path is cutting a path through. But it's not necessarily in a deeper sense of the word, that's a very superficial teaching. He went a lot deeper throughout the course of his practice. It wasn't in the sense of avoidance in every respect, because when you, as I was pointing out in my Dhamma talk, my short intro this morning, as you go deeper, things maybe appear on the superficial level as being extreme and opposites and avoidance. But as you go deeper down, you see more of a path of non-separation and inclusion. So he formulated this path initially as an avoidance of these two types of things, but actually, I think Nagarjuna said it quite well. You probably all know Nagarjuna's expression of this, that Nibbana is samsara and samsara is Nibbana, because where else would Nibbana be? It's right here, right now. If you're planning for it to be somewhere in the future and then you have to practice to attain it, you're already creating a separation from that. It's obviously beyond space and time, but beyond space and time is here. In samsara. It's right now. And so it's an interesting thing that nirvana and nivarana are actually etymologically related, that the hindrances and nibbana, as we say in Pali, are actually convey a similar type of thing. There's actually an insight there for all of us that I'm trying to point us all to. And nivarana is kind of that, it can mean that which holds us back, that's that primordial avoidance and aversion that I was talking about, that's pulling us back. Sense of being held back, being collapsed, unable to release and express, be present in the present moment. That sense of an obstacle. Nirvana is like sweeping away, and so they appear opposites, but they're also related etymologically. And the hindrances fall at a kind of crux between these two, and create an opportunity to see the practice in a more unified way. For me, I have to admit, this is a very personal topic for me. The five hindrances. It meant a lot to my early practice. Um, some of you don't know this about me, but um, people see a Westerner when they look at me. But I actually have a very deep mystical side to me. When I was a child, I had epilepsy and I had a vision. My visions were part of my epilepsy. I was remembering past lives and all sorts of things. And my very first vision that I had after my epilepsy was uh, entering into a cave, and the cave getting tighter and tighter and more treacherous, and then coming out to a source of light. And at the end of the tunnel was me as an older man who happened to be a slightly younger version of me now. And he explained to this young man that he put 5 stones on the ground of this cave. And he said, there are 5 stones that are obstacles in your life. And he named, my mom took notes of these because initially she thought it was crazy. Then she wrote it all down because she saw how much I was learning from them. He said, the goal of your spiritual practice will be to remove each of these stones so that birth and death can become one. And it took me years because I wasn't born in a Buddhist family. I didn't know what it means for birth and death to become one. But there should be no more death and no more birth, for them to be one thing. It's not an avoidance of birth and death. It's when they collapse and when they become one. And that was my introduction to the 5 hindrances, but I didn't know they were a thing for the longest time. It took me well into my 20s to realize that they would be fruitful for my practice. And I remember my first Dhamma talk on the 5 hindrances, and it was presented to me as just merely something to be avoided, to be suppressed, to be dealt with. And I realized that they were a deep form, as I shared this morning, of energetics, of actually, I was overwhelmed by samsara. I was overwhelmed by suffering, to be quite honest with you. I was desperate. I was in a state of despair, wichikicha, we call doubt. But I really didn't think, something inside of me was screaming against samsara, against suffering. And I think I was overwhelmed by how to get out of suffering, because it seemed like a many, many, many limbed beast wrapping itself around me. And whereas you take off one arm and another arm comes, you take off another arm, and it's just like this endless path. And suddenly I had this, and so I started, well, at least the hindrances are just 5. I can deal with that form of suffering for now. And so I went into a deep sort of labeling of the hindrances. And I just decided I was going to know when a hindrance arose and when it disappeared after I got my first description of the 4 foundations of mindfulness. So I knew that I was going to pay attention to the hindrance. I was just going to focus on that. And literally, I would keep accounts because I had a good mind for accounts and it interested me. So I just wanted to take stock of what is, so I could figure out what to do next. And so I would literally count, well, that was desire, that was anger, that was, sloth and torpor, that was doubt, that was restlessness. And I would literally count them and have a tally. And without just purely equanimously, I was just tallying up the contents of that were occurring in the mind and just looking at the numbers. And I found that the Buddha talks about people having certain propensities towards certain hindrances. Well, my propensity was desire. I had very little anger. There was quite a bit of sadness, which I decided I'd put everything in these 5 hindrances. So sadness to me came up as a form of anger to myself, something, or anger towards the world, like I couldn't fix something that I felt, and it would turn into a kind of frustration. And I realized frustration was anger. And so I quickly developed this vocabulary where everything was reduced to these 5, because you'll find more complex ways of viewing these things. Desire can be complex, it can have many names, can appear in many forms. Aversion appears in many, many forms, and many emotions, and many things will come up. And all the other ones too, but I pretty much fit everything into that paradigm. Every emotion that came up, every thought that came up. And I just got a sense that I just needed to practice a little bit of metta for anger and hatred. But most of my practice, I needed to focus on what this desire was coming up, what these fantasies were coming up, and why I was going all the way on this retreat, taking all this time out of my life, it's eating 1 meal a day, and I'm sitting here fantasizing, what's going on with that? And how many times does it come up? And when does it come up? Does it come up more in the morning? Is it there more at night? Is it after mealtime? Is it before mealtime? What were the objects that were changing? And what was feeding all of this? And I realized that I could just, certain types of fantasies that would come up would be sort of just kind of something like very, very subtle and very minor. And so I quickly realized that was just kind of something like boredom, and that the mind was just producing a kind of image of something that it wanted to occupy itself with, almost like a form of restlessness. It wanted to do it. So it would produce a kind of relationship with that desire. And I realized I was turning it into a story. And so I thought, well, what if I just stop and turn my mind away from that object and turned it back to just the sensation of what's here and what's arising? And I found that most of those objects disappeared, and I noticed my tally started going down dramatically. That was one time. I don't think I kept all these statistics, but I was sort of just tallying up the contents of my mind. I realized that was one cliff that really let things go. And I later found out that the Buddha talked about in the Vichakasantana Sutta, as you all know, in the Majjhima Nikaya, the Buddha gave a Dhamma talk on distractions, on how to relax the mind. And one of them is, for minor and mild distractions, just put the mind on either the opposite, or put the mind on just something else. Just move the mind onto a more skillful object. Sometimes all you have to do is just move it. But sometimes you have to actually contemplate the opposite of what you're looking at. And so sometimes, in particular with desire, we tend to only look at the positive side of the thing. If you actually take just a little bit of mental energy to look at all the 360 view of the thing, not everything you think is beautiful. Or not everything. I don't know if you noticed today, but if you chew more than 10 times, the flavor leaves the food. And so a lot of people chew really quickly because they love food. But if you actually chewed more than 10 times, it actually gets annoying because your muscles get really sore. All the flavor leaves and you're just chewing fiber basically in your mouth without any taste. And your taste buds get inured to it. So you can contemplate if you're really, really hungry and craving food, you can think about these things while you're doing that. And it can serve. And so I noticed with just using these techniques of just moving my mind when the mild said, but it's really severe if I would just turn my mind to the thing and just really notice it. You can either avoid it in the first instance and not feed it, I should say, not feed it with any thoughts of, oh yeah, wouldn't that be nice? Don't have a conversation with it. Take your mind back to the breath, for example. Or you could really address it and just notice all the other qualities about it, what things you like and dislike, and that will lead to more equanimity with respect to the object. So I did this and I noticed quite a significant drop in the occurrence of desire. And then I noticed that if I really focused in on the desire, that it was really just something that any breath sensation was composed of. In other words, it was composed of warmth, heat. It was composed of, fire elements. It was composed of air elements. There was a buzzing sensation in there, a tingling sensation in the desire. There was a pressure. There was a sense of arising towards it, something that was just pushing, like you couldn't even say no to it, even if you wanted, like a sense of pressure, and a collapsing of that object, in imaginary collapse of me into that object, so becoming one. And it was very interesting for me to notice that primarily there was just movements towards things and movements away from things in meditation. And there was just a back and forth movement, and there was just the elements within each of these movements. And that I noticed more unity in my mind, that I was able to identify, well, that was just a label, that was a hindrance. It's really just an energetic experience that's inseparable from the breath. And I would notice some of the energy from, say, a fantasy would lead towards more concentration, more energy in the practice. It would lead to more effort. And I realized, oh, so hindrances aren't 100% bad. There's a piece of them that I can take from them. And even anger, as I was saying earlier, you can take a little bit of confidence from that and a little bit of strength and leave the rest there. So that was a big drop off as well. And it strengthened my breath practice. And then I started noticing that at a very fundamental level, when I realized that there was really no ability to really move towards a thing or move away from things, it was always just here. That really helped me see into the nature of experience as well, that I was just labeling a sensation as desire and labeling another sensation as aversion, but fundamentally they weren't, at the deepest layer, they weren't that different. There was tingling going on, there was a field of awareness, there was thoughts and labels and perceptions and stories and sankharas and new forms of becoming and new forms of suffering. But underneath everything, it was just one sort of undifferentiated field. And that really helped me relax. And it helped me get to a layer where the hindrances just didn't bother me or didn't arise anymore. And I was able to see that the hindrances, how deeply they were rooted, how deeply they were really cured. The Buddha said they're cured by, let's see, at least 4 sets of things, but we could say there are more. One set of things that it's cured by is that the hindrances are sort of massaged by, you could say, is mindfulness, 4 foundations of mindfulness. He said that quite frequently. When the hindrances are present, practice the four foundations of mindfulness. In practicing the four foundations of mindfulness, the hindrances will not be a problem or an obstacle for you. And just being in that presence, in that field of awareness that I'm telling you about, without any separation from it, allowed me to set aside, I think, and see through the hindrances. I don't know if you all know the definition of right mindfulness that the Buddha gave, but he says, for example, that when a bhikkhu contemplates the body with reference to the body, with he vineya loke abhijja domanasang. So he sets aside abhijja and domanasang. And so this is basically two different words for the two sides of the middle path. You set aside liking and disliking, basically, overcoming, entering into a layer of equanimity, finding a balance between the two, and entering into this presence, this openness of experience, without interpretation and without labels. Deepest layer of equanimity is certainly, so when we're in the body, instead of saying, I have a back pain because I did too much gym work, we're putting the frame of the body into, I'm accusing myself of having done too much work in the gym yesterday. And so it suddenly becomes into a story. But when you put the body into the frame of the body, you're just experiencing the fact that you have pain in the body without putting the frame of the body into the frame of feeling, oh, this is an unpleasant feeling, or within the frame of the mind. Remember, the third foundation of mindfulness is, when the mind is averse, know that it's averse. When the mind doesn't have any aversion in it, know that there's no aversion in it. And so it's then putting it into the story of aversion, and how it relates to all the other dhammas in the fourth foundation of mindfulness, and creating a whole story around it. So that was very powerful as well for me, to situate the mindfulness practice, leaving things in their frame and not translating the mind into the body and the body into the mind, leaving each in their own domain. There's a insight knowledge, Namarupa Uparicheda Jnana, which is, you get to this point in your practice when you realize that the body just has a different type of dynamic to its suffering than the mind does. And the two, initially you don't really think about it. You think, oh, maybe when you start off your practice, that your mind's in your brain and in your body, and it's confined to that. And then you begin to see that they are different. And they start to separate out. And so you begin to see fatigue, for example, in the mind as being separate from fatigue in the body, as we mentioned earlier today. And restlessness in the mind is different from restlessness in the body. And each one needs a slightly different medicine to approach it with. And that was also quite a discovery for me, to see through, kind of gently sort of separate the two, and to address each a little differently. And also, when I couldn't handle something in the mind, I would go to its correlate in the body. For example, if I was lost in a thought, sometimes a thought or doubt or restlessness, something, a mental component, might actually have be having a conversation. It might be even fed by a point of tension somewhere. Anger can be sometimes, a point of tension either in the gut or something like that, or a beating heart or pressure right here or here. And you might not look at it because you're focused, in your mind, you're focused on the object of your anger, like on the outside, something someone said to you that was unjust. But it might be fed actually by a sensation here in the face. It might be uncomfortable and you're reacting to that sensation. And it's important to take a look when we can't handle something, when anger might be too big, to actually look at its source in the body. And as soon as you see that, you see that you can handle it, that there's actually some fear that you can't handle opening up to that sensation. But it's just heat, it's just pressure, it's just sensation, it's just vibrational movement. All these things you can handle in any intensity. It's just the labels we can't handle. Like, I'm angry, we feel ashamed with that label. Like, I can't, oh, I'm a spiritual person, I can't be angry at that. But anyway, taking everything, pointing, when things get too much on one side, go to the other side. And you can sometimes deal with them just by breathing into those spaces and to let them relax. And then you can go back. It's easier to go back and address whatever labels you may have on the outside, and to understand them and challenge them. The other point, I think, was that the hindrances also point to not only progressively. I kind of had a Dhamma download when I decided at some point, I was meditating for a year. I decided I had reached a point in my practice where I could actually figure out how to send a vision back to myself as a little child. I did have a bit of a Dhamma download about that, and it was very clear to me that the hindrances did correlate to the progressive path. But for the Buddha, they sit right at the center of the hindrances, between the early part of the path of dana and sila. And just as you're cultivating kusala dhamma, good qualities of the mind, it's what shows up when you're trying to concentrate your mind and empty out your mind and just be present to what's arising. It's what the mind can get obsessed about. And so it's really this quality of obsession, of repetitive thinking, that you then start taking a look at. Because what we repeat to ourselves over and over, we create grooves and habits and karma around. And I'm sure you've all seen that in your life already. I'm sure you're all observant enough to notice that when you do have a tendency towards an angry mode of reactivity, for example, people know that in you, and then you live a different life than someone who has a desiring mode of reactivity or a confusion mode of reactivity. There's just different energetics, different situations, different approaches. And it depends on every person. Every person is going to have a different set of cause. I started looking at it as like a clockmaker at some point. Started noticing, well, just how exactly was I made up within all that? It may have been, and some of it led to sort of images and reflections, like my desiring propensity may have come from a feeling that I didn't get enough of certain things when I was there. So it was a sense of aversion towards not having had enough, but it was just a story. was a story that I needed to take a look at. And in fact, it was a story that helped me unwind some of that desire as well. And I noticed even more of a drop off of that obsessive type of thinking. It just became easier and easier just to settle my mind into one point and concentrate as soon as I started going through all these insights in my path of practice. And I started, noticing that they all point to a certain level of awareness as well. Certain qualities in awareness that I shared with you this morning. I went through all that really quickly, but we can talk about it more. And I found them to be really helpful. That just in seeing that the good qualities, for example, in my mind, were when my mind was able to just see the energy, the foundational presence of that it had a sort of fullness, natural fullness to it. And that the state of desiring was based on just a view that there was no fullness anywhere, that it could never be satisfied. And I saw in an instant that you get that flash that the of dukkha, of understanding of dukkha yana, that it's just a view, it's just a perception, that I wasn't really taking a serious look in the fullness. And so for me, that would have often pointed to how the 5 hindrances are opposed to the 7 factors of awakening. And I saw very clearly how they point by point feed into the other. So they strengthen the ability not only to concentrate, but to yata bhuta dasana yana, to come to know things as they are, reality as it is. And so for me, in my practice, desire was rebalanced when I discovered just the natural fullness that was always there, that I didn't. It's almost like, in this sense of I am, just right now, if you just tell yourself I am and what you're feeling energetically. I think when I started off on my practice, I noticed like pockets of emptiness. And when we have this sense of pockets of emptiness, and it's just like I said, a view that's created. I noticed with the breath practice, these pockets started to fill out when I really started to notice this field of awareness. And I was less inclined to go looking for objects of pleasure on the outside. That suddenly I realized everything's here. That it was just a story. And that really, to me, points to piti, which is one of the 7 factors of awakening. Aversion, the second hindrance, for me, that stance of pulling back, basically, from experience, is, all of them come with some level of reflection. The first factor of awakening is mindfulness. And so we just went through the 4 foundations of mindfulness and how they can counter the hindrances. So there's just a certain level of awareness of desire, and awareness of each of was sufficient, but there's just also a certain layer of I think I'm going to jump out of order, as Dhammavichaya is the second one. And I noticed that really counterbalanced with Vicikiccha, the 5th hindrance, the 5th object, which was that sort of despairing idea that you can never, you're never going to get to the bottom and solve the problem of suffering and release from suffering. And so for me, Dhammavichaya balanced really well with that. And passaddhi, or calm, for me was uh, how I calmed down a very low level of restlessness. Those two balanced each other really well. Um, just developing that being here with this sensation is enough, that I didn't have to run um, from just whatever's arising. And energy, virya, which is another factor, balances, of course, with sloth and torpor, tina, mita. And and that all these things were sort of naturally present in the breath. I think aversion didn't really break until my samadhi became really strong, and my equanimity practice became really, really strong as well, because it's a very subtle practice. As I said at the beginning when I was talking, the Buddha posited that desire was the cause of all suffering in his first Dhamma talk to the five brethren. And later, when he gave the Samaditi Sutta, the teaching on right view, he subtly introduces in there that aversion is even beneath that, this sense that maybe I don't have enough, and so I'm seeking more. And that sort of confirmed how I was experiencing desire, and what was healing my own desire was this sense of fullness. And that was really under that was an identity structure that I could step back from reality and control things, not like things and like things. And it really, as my equanimity practice softened and liking and disliking sorted to, become even one experience, I started to be able to almost flip my experience of something just by noticing certain different characteristics. For example, I whacked my head against a board once, and I just noticed like a bell was struck. I mean, there was pain there. If I focused on the pain, if I looked at it as pain, and oh me, what a stupid person I am. But if I just felt the vibrational bell, I just felt vibrations. And even with focusing just on foundation of feelings, I noticed that, in pleasurable feelings, there's just heat, there's just vibration. And I noticed then in a painful feeling, there's just heat, there's just vibration. And I noticed the similarities between the two. And you can almost, in your mind, go between the two. You're not subject anymore to the whims of, that type of simple labeling. The experience itself is the same, is unitary. Just on top of that, we put this label of sukha vedana or asukha vedana or dukkha vedana. And so things kind of started to become more neutral to me, but it was more neutral play, not neutral ignorance. It was neutral knowledge, equanimous, very equanimous for me. And that was really a huge step for me. And then it sort of dawned on me that the Buddha's 10 fetter model to describe awakening were really just an elaboration of the 5 hindrances. And so if you're thinking progressively towards deep awareness, I mean, he said Wicikicca's the last hindrance, but it's the first to go in the fetter model. As we recited today, it's one of the early lower fetters. And that's really just suddenly, it's almost confidence that you can see that there is an end to this. As I was saying earlier, to me, it was just this realization that suffering was huge and vast and overwhelming, but I could reduce it to 5 objects like the hindrances and begin to work my way through it. Just like the English language is infinite, but we only have 26 letters, right? So all things have a base limit, right? Even though you can produce an infinite number of variations of those 26 letters. Um, it was a huge, revelation for me. And I guess um, liking and disliking goes in many phases. It's not like it goes off immediately. Wichikicha, doubt, can go quickly. You can go quickly. It's a sudden shift when you have your first glimpse of awakening. You suddenly have confidence that what the Buddha was talking about, he actually did, and that there's actually teachings and a path to actually do it, and that there's a sangha. There's actually people who are actually achieving this stuff, and that they can convey it and model it. That confidence in the Buddha Dhamma Sangha, to me, was just that human beings can do it. The Buddha, there's a way to describe it. It's actually reality. Dhamma means reality. It's actually part of our innate reality, and that we can hold this knowledge together as a community and help others awaken. And that was a radical shift for me when that happened. And you can label things stream entry. You can say the fetters disappear and you can ascribe things to them. But you're really talking about the hindrances. You're talking about overcoming a hindrance, that it actually completely disappears. And for me, that was really radical. Fast. Liking and disliking in terms of the first two fetters actually took quite a long time in my practice. And there were many layers of how that appeared and disappeared. And sometimes even after an awakening experience, a very deep meditation experience on long retreats, the hindrances will come back very strongly. And it took me a long time to realize that that's okay. It's just an energy that needs to leave. It's almost like, I didn't know that. Yeah, I mean, you read Bessel van den Kolk and things like that. I mean, trauma kind of lives in the memory cells of the body, and it takes a deep practice. And I think the samadhi practice, the calm samadhi practice, and the energetics that we're talking about in the breath actually release that. And it has to come out through expression sometimes. If you only keep translated into a meditation mode and you keep denying that mode and saying your ability, it needs to be expressed energetically, it needs to come out. But if you're telling yourself, I can't experience anger, and you keep holding it back down, you're actually holding it back in. And so some of this stuff needs to be expressed and not just described. Oh, I had this experience, I keep struggling with desire, I just had this awakening experience, how can this be happening to me? Then you question that experience. No, it was in the past, it was what it was, the insights were there. There was a falling away of an identity structure, less attachment. You're moving in the right direction, but you're going through a period where you might have to express some type of anger at having been wronged. And it's okay to look at those things in our childhood when we couldn't express them, and now we can. And we can challenge those beliefs. Maybe you weren't wronged. It's important to question that type of thing, but we carry a lot of stories around in us, and that really affects how our mix of hindrances express themselves and when. And obviously, restlessness falls away at the very end of the path, and conceit, and ignorance, and really base levels of turning away from things. But yeah, so it really occurred to me that it was a worthwhile thing for all of us to look at, and that maybe I could share some of this with you today, just to describe kind of what my path was through all this. And I kind of wanted to save some time for some questions and some back and forth, if that's okay. We can have a few minutes for that. I hope that was helpful for you.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop recording it just so you feel if you have a question that